it's great to have you back. And every day brings us more reminders of the importance of what we're talking about today, I think. The goal of this series, as you know, is to bring sociological theory and research into a closer and more productive dialogue in order to multiply our impact on scholarship and on social policy. And because of that goal, I can't, again, imagine a better focus, a more important focus than today's uh, uh, concern with the spillover of viruses and disease from the non-human animal world to the human world. Mike Lengefeld will be talking to us about treadmills of production and distribution that accelerate zoonotic spillover, which is, of course, exactly what has happened in the COVID-19 pandemic. And he'll also touch on the importance of understanding normal accident theory. And Erin Evans will broaden our perspective by looking at how we understand mass production, factory farming, in relation to increasing the risk of zoonotic spillover, even as it also increases the risk to animal welfare. So with no further ado, I will ask my partner in this endeavor, Rengen Firat, to introduce the two speakers.
Thank you, Russ. Do you want me to introduce Erin as well? I'm not sure if she's showing up or not, but
yeah, why don't you do that too?
I'm gonna read Erin's bio really quick as well. If she shows up, we can just pick up from where we left. Erin Evans is an assistant professor of sociology at San Diego Mesa College. Her work focuses on social movement and the pros and cons of institutionalizing movement demands, and it can be found in publications like Sociological Perspectives, Social Movement Studies, Society and Animals, and various edited volumes. And now I'd like to introduce Michael Ryan Lengefeld. And Michael Ryan Lengefeld is a visiting assistant professor of environmental sociology at Goucher College. His focus on social justice guides his research and work with community organizations such as the Food Recovery Network and the Goucher Prison Education Project. Professor Lengefeld teaches courses in sociology and environmental studies with a focus on social and environmental transformation. His research examines the intersection of political ecology and more, with the emphasis on the ways in which the developing tension between war and society has transformed the global ecology. Dr. Langefeld's comparative historical work on the environmental consequences of Cold War nuclear weapons production and the US war on drugs in Latin America is published in the Journal of World Systems Research, Human Ecology Review, and Armed Forces and Society. And Mike, I see that you have co-authors on this essay, Greg Hooks and Chad Smith. If you want to say a couple words about them, you're welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess one place to start was Greg and Chad were my co-authors. Chad was the chair of my master's thesis at Texas State, and Greg was the chair of my PhD dissertation. Chad was also on my dissertation panel as well. So we've been working together in this area of our subfield for quite a while. But obviously, this zoonotic spillover thing kind of really came into view in the last year as a very important point of emphasis that we needed to incorporate into our understanding. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much for your introduction.
Yeah, thank you. And the floor is yours. You can go ahead and talk about your essay, and then we will open it for discussion question.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, well, with that, I will take over the screen momentarily in an authoritarian way to introduce my rudimentary kind of presentation here, just to orient what I'm talking about. Okay, and so I'm trained as an environmental sociologist and a political sociologist, and as when you mentioned, I teach environmental studies as well. So we do discuss evolutionary thought in that course, and towards the end of our discussion, I do have some thoughts on the relevance for this for evolutionary thought as well. But the basic contribution we were trying to make with this piece has to do with understanding how major theories in environmental and political sociology can be brought to bear upon the biological understanding of zoonotic spillover. And so the major goal here was just to flesh out these connections. And in that regard, this was an exploratory kind of piece that we wrote. And we wanted to identify some of the organizational dynamics and the social structures that environmental sociologists have identified that accelerate and heighten the risk of zoonotic spillover. And for a general definition of zoonotic spillover is the spillover of animal viruses into human populations. And so we had, as the title of our piece is, we have two major contributions we're focusing on from social science that really provide insight into how we might understand zoonotic spillover. And so Charles Perrow's work with high-risk technologies comes out of organizational sociology, and his famous book, Normal Accidents, was quite influential. And in this book, his major focus, his immediate concern is the failure of tightly integrated and complex technological systems. And so he discusses the Challenger disaster in this book. And, his central point in this book is that although each individual component of this complex system is engineered to meet exceedingly high standards, such as a failure is only 1 in a million trials, when every component in a system has to work simultaneously, they're coupled, and there's a complex system, and you have a million trials, well, the chances of a catastrophic accident are actually surprisingly high. And in that statistical sense, they become normal. And so the logic of this for zoonotic spillover that we were trying to bring in is that, well, we can think about these pathogen spillover events, these zoonotic spillovers, as being linked with these human and animal interactions between, again, the natural hosts, such as bats, for example, which serve as reservoirs for many of these SARS coronaviruses, and then the intermediate hosts, such as the domesticated animals, which are often connected with the transmission between these natural hosts and then the human populations. And so, again, applying Perrow's logic about these complicated high-risk technologies and the tight coupling and complex systems dynamics that emerge, well, if we apply that to zoonotic spillovers and we think about the idea of each chance encounter between a member of the human community and a member of one of these natural communities that hosts these viruses or intermediately hosts them, well, the chance of spillover increasingly grows and accelerates as the number of encounters grows. And in the current organization of our society, the Anthropocene, as Paul Crutzen has termed it, these encounters are growing quite rapidly and in some cases exponentially. And we can look back even just since 1945, we can see the growth of many of these processes really accelerating dynamics that expose humans to these viruses. And so you might be asking yourself, well, what kind of processes are we talking about? Well, that's where we drew in from this treadmill theory. And so in environmental sociology, the treadmill theory is a foundational theory. It was established by Alan Schneeberg, and originally, interestingly, in connection with my co-panelist's piece, the original treadmill theory focused on the growth in chemical inputs, fertilizers, and pesticides in the agricultural sector after World War II. And the central message, part of what we were doing with this piece is we were recasting that treadmill theory in a new light, kind of trying to reorient it for some of the internal debates regarding its usefulness. And so what we were doing is saying, well, there's an economic treadmill. Much of our work talks about treadmills can emerge from military competition. So these certain treadmills can emerge as powerful organizations compete in capitalist competition and they exploit nature and extract resources. And they do this sometimes in a competition that threatens their organizational vitality, right? If you don't keep up with competition, your organization will be absorbed or lost. And so these corporations that are participating in this are caught in this kind of treadmill where they're forced to increase with a profit margin as their central overriding goal. They're forced to increase extraction, increase the externalities and the negative environmental externalities, such as waste inputs into the environment. And thus the pace of degradation quickens and it's increasingly accelerating. And so one example of this, you might think of, well, unless a corporation tries to keep pace in resource extraction and production processes, they'll be disadvantaged. And if you apply this to other important high-level social organizational dynamics, such as the military, well, we can think of an arms race with the military as also, in some cases, producing a treadmill. We call this a treadmill of destruction, whereas the economic-driven treadmill is a treadmill of production. So in the case of a treadmill of destruction, you can think about the nuclear arms race, which much of my work focuses on this. Between the Soviet Union and the United States, there was this treadmill of arms races in which increasingly noxious and hazardous, qualitatively noxious and hazardous inputs into the environment resulted from nuclear weapons production, moving from fission weapons to thermonuclear weapons and so forth. And so those are our the two central contributions here, thinking about how tightly coupled and complex systems facilitate such a large number of iterations that normal accidents become regular in a statistical sense and expected. And then also merging that thinking with our understanding of how treadmills exponentially increase these interactions that human organizations have with the natural world. And in thinking about, I took much of this thinking from my Intro to Environmental Studies book that I teach with at Goucher. Historian William McNeill talks about the idea that history can be understood as the interactions among parasites. I think it's a very provocative idea. And he notes that the host population evolves slowly compared with the generational timescale of a virus. And the characteristics of the host become significant for the evolution of the microbes as well. And, the interesting analog here is, well, there's an analog for macroparasites in the human world. Humans can be macroparasites. And certain organizations within human society can become macroparasitic. We might call these, in human history, marauders or criminals, and today dysfunctional institutions really kind of are what I envision when I think of these macroparasites. And when we think about the organization of human history and transformations that have happened in the way we organize our societies, empires, a key invention, a durable invention of empires was bureaucratic organization. And so in modern society today, we can recognize that some bureaucracies become insular and they can run amok in their efforts to extract and degrade the natural environment. And again, my work on the Cold War nuclear arms race is very much enlightening in regard to that. But in terms of zoonotic spillover, many of these dynamics of extraction that expose humans to the natural world in increasing iterations increase the potential for spillovers of zoonotic diseases. And that's where I will end for now.
Thank you, Michael, for that very insightful presentation. We have not heard yesterday or today from Erin Evans, who had confirmed her plan to present today about a month ago. So I am worried about her situation, but she is not with us. I'll just take 1 minute or two to summarize her points, which many of you may have read at this point in her article on our website, and just say that Michael's last point is really the perfect segue to that article and to Erin's essay, and really shows us the connection between understanding species in the natural world and the impact of humans on our exposure to them. Because Erin's essay takes us back to Sinclair Lewis's The Jungle, published in 1905, and reminds us of the awful conditions experienced by often immigrant workers in the meatpacking industry over 100 years ago. What she does, though, is to point out that the movement that arose in response to these awful working conditions, stimulated in part by Sinclair Lewis's book, really focused on the employee welfare and preventing abusive treatment of workers, but did not change the movement toward mass production in meat packing. And in fact, the progression of the emphasis on increasing the production of meat for the market really led us to the current system of factory farming, which involves concentrated living quarters and increasing the speed of growth and of animals and the efficiency of killing of animals for the human market. And these have created much more crowded conditions on factories, on factory farms, that, of course, increase the ability of viruses to spread and mutate. She also points in her essay to the problem of speciesism, leading to a lack of concern with animal welfare beyond that of having conditions that improve the efficiency of production. And so in both these respects, the mass production of food on farms and the lack of attention sufficiently to animal welfare has really undergirded the problem of zoonotic spillover that Michael focused on. So at this point, I hope I did not do Erin a disservice in that summary, but there are a number of questions in the thread now. Did you want to ask the first one, Rengen? And then I see David Sloan Wilson has a comment too.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Russ. Mike, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your essay and your presentation now. I wasn't, to be honest, I wasn't that familiar with the concept of zoonotic spillover before I read your essay. So I was like fascinated by it. It's just very interesting conceptually. And I was particularly interested in your concepts of the treadmills of destruction and production. And I was curious, and I know that in your own research, you studied in different national contexts, like comparative contexts. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and give us a sense of how that works at the global scale, because that's the part where humans enter, right? That's the human intervention. Like, how does it work globally, cross-nationally? Because it's affecting, like, I'm imagining it's affecting different parts of the world disparately. And how does it talk to the global economy, like political economy?
Yeah.
And if you could talk about these, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful question. Thank you. You know, I guess one distinction that's important to make regarding these two treadmills. Number one, they aren't in opposition to each other. They just posit a different causal force in the outcomes of degradation, right? So the production treadmill assumes that certain modes of capitalist organization and the dynamics inherent in stakeholder shareholder relations facilitate these environmental outcomes, which also have negative outcomes for communities and workers. And then the destruction treadmill emphasizes the idea of a military-driven environmental degradation dynamic. And so two contexts in which we've examined these are I've looked at nuclear weapons, of course, as I just discussed, and that's a very distinctive treadmill destruction dynamic, right? Arguments have been made that the military industrial complex and corporations have pushed that, but that's a distinctly geopolitical thing that the military has advanced for decades. I think more interesting perhaps for this discussion would be our recent research examining these two treadmills as they intersect in Latin America in regards to cocaine production in the Andes and in the Amazon region. And so, I was kind of tracking some of the conversations that were happening in the chat as well. And one way to think about this, especially with cocaine production, is okay, you've got 60% of the global market for cocaine is in the US, the rest is in Europe, essentially, the majority of it. And these markets for cocaine in the global north are facilitating these extractive dynamics, which are very environmentally harmful in the global south, right? All the cocaine in the world is essentially grown in Latin America. And it's all being shipped out of Latin America to the global north, right? And so the American military's effort to deal with this problem was essentially to commit ecocide in many regards, right? To spray glyphosate, a known cancer-causing agent, over many parts of the Amazon and the Andes basin, the Amazon basin and the Andes slopes. And so you have this really interesting intersection. Now, of course, what's really going on there is a violent civil war in Colombia with many violent actors and organizations who are mobilizing these resources for different purposes, but most of them are geopolitical purposes, right? To facilitate their goals. You know, you've got Marxist revolutionary groups fighting, you've got conservative state actors fighting over these resources. And all these resources, again, are part of this global market for cocaine in the global north, right? So again, you've got a military dynamic intersecting with an economic dynamic driving a synergistic type of environmental degradation in the most ecologically sensitive place in the world, right? The Amazon. And so we can think about, well, how would that kind of thing increase zoonotic spillover? Well, these cycles of eradication essentially they do several things. One thing they do is cause massive forced displacement, right? So one of the things that these poor peasant coca growers are doing, who most of them are caught in between the state and these violent armed groups being forced to grow coca. Well, when your crop gets eradicated, you have to go somewhere where the state can't find you. Where is that? Well, it's deeper into the rainforest, right? And so these groups keep going deeper and deeper into territory that's in some cases preserved national territory, net protected environmental areas. And in these areas, they have greater exposure to the animals that harbor these viruses. And on top of that, this is just a kind of a recent comment, but we saw in the last few days another outbreak of Ebola happening in West Africa. And that has repeatedly been connected with not only civil war and political violence there, but also with the use of bushmeat, right? So when you've got a huge military force and you've got degraded social institutions, poor access even to basic necessities, well, sometimes they'll just go out and shoot what's available and eat that. And that is another source of zoonotic spillover. And so as this pervasive dynamic continues in West Africa and Central Africa, and we see these spillovers keep occurring over and over and over again. And the reporting I saw on it noted that people are much more terrified of Ebola than COVID, understandably, right? And so these are, again, kind of some of the dynamics that we were focusing on in regarding treadmills that increase human exposure to these pathogens in the environment.
Yeah, so shall I take my turn?
Sure.
Thank you, David. Go ahead.
Thank you for these comments and the two great essays. I want to spend a minute just on straight up biological genetic evolution to make a point that should be widely appreciated, but actually still isn't, even in 2021, which is that evolution doesn't make everything nice. It often results in treadmills. In fact, it usually results in treadmills. And it's very important to distinguish between two kinds of complex adaptive systems, to use a key word. One is a complex system that is adaptive as a system, such as a multicellular organism or a social insect colony. And the other is a complex system composed of agents following their respective adaptive strategies. And I call this a CAS1 and a CAS2 systems. And the important point to make for both biological evolution and human cultural evolution is that typically CAS2 systems do not self-organize into CAS1 systems. They're treadmills. And if you go to non-human single-species societies, such as primate societies or multi-species ecosystems, such as the beaver ecosystem, what you find is treadmills. I mean, they're basins of attraction. They're often out of equilibrium. There's just lots of suffering that takes place. And the only exception to that rule is when the system is itself a unit of selection. So why is it that single multicellular organisms, social insect colonies, and even ecosystems such as microbiomes are actually not treadmills, that they actually function well as systems? It's because they were units of selection. And when we get then to human life and cultural evolution, it's no different. I mean, most human systems are CAS2 systems. They're systems of agents following their respective adaptive strategies. And Mike, you were just giving rich detail about how that goes in various contexts. I pointed to in the chat, I pointed to a series of essays on TiVo titled "The Cultural Evolution of Social Pathologies," featuring Anthony Biglin, who y'all should know about. And he just takes cases like the tobacco industry, big pharma, the fruit industry, the arms industry, you name it. And it's pathological, not because people are evil, it's because they're all basically being selected by consequences. And that's what you end up with, treadmills. So the conclusion is inevitable that if we want to get off of a treadmill, we have to impose system level selection. We have to seek to, however you want to describe it, in evolutionary terms or any other terms you want to describe it, no matter what words you use, the whole system has to be the object, the target of selection. That's what's needed. And you can describe it any way you want. And so there's a whole piece to be said about that. And I mean, there could not be a more important set of issues for us in order to get off all the treadmills of, of life. So I hope I didn't go on too long, but I mean, it's a deep, deep issue. Of course, it's what we're all trying to do, is to turn CAS2 systems into CAS1 systems. And that's what's needed.
Did you want to elaborate on your question, Simon, about international travel, which seems to complicate, if you will, the question of just what the unit of selection actually is in the human world?
Sorry, yeah, I just questioned whether human-animal interactions have increased or decreased over time. It strikes me they've decreased. I don't know many goats or bats myself, but in the past we definitely would have been in contact with them. And isn't the real issue here the ultra-sociability of humans? That I think Robert Trivers, one of the evolutionary biologists, said at the start of the pandemic a year ago, we've evolved socially over 200,000 years, and we're fighting a virus that's evolved over 2 million years. And that's the game here, really.
And Michael, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, it's a fascinating point. I guess, you know, trying to think about multiple timelines unfolding, you know, the way I was, when we were writing this essay, I believe, kind of one of the ways we were thinking about it is, well, you know, you see a huge transformation in human societies after 1945, after World War II, right? And of course, our ability to participate in international travel has increased exponentially since that time as well, right? As our technologies have allowed such. But, you know, importantly, if you look at that same time period, or if you just look at going back all the way through all of our records of zoonotic spillovers in human history, there's a distinct pattern of increases, and they're becoming exponentially more frequent. And so, you know, in tethering the logic of those increases to the logic of our productive organization, not just in, you know, in often American societies, the focal point of this, but on a global sense, the organization of production increases human activities that expose these reservoir species to our populations. And so I guess to your point, yes, we may not be hanging around with bats and goats and cows, all of us, regularly, but if you have very large, for example, in the fact with Erin's piece, you know, Erin's piece was about the factory farm essentially, and about how these factory farms become these kind of ticking time bombs for zoonotic spillovers, right? It's a place where the virus can evolve and mutate, and then it's got a constant source of exposure to the people who are working in these facilities, who in very, you know, to highlight social inequality, are often bearing the brunt of much social inequality as well. And so that's kind of the, I know that's kind of a way around answering your question about international travel, but I think the purpose here is to highlight how other human activities, ones that are prevalent and central to the functioning of the global economy, are increasingly exposing us as humans to these reservoirs of viruses. Does that kind of get at your at what you're asking?
Yes, I think it's a complex issue though, isn't it? Because as you say, we've got reservoirs of animals, and humans, because in the UK, we look at these vectors of transmission. It turns out it's a very small number of people are causing an enormous increase in viral transmission. So it is rather a complex interplay of these two reservoirs, human social reservoirs and animal reservoirs, and where we come into contact. But yes, you did answer it. Thank you.
I mean, it's a great question.
Steve Gilbert, you had some thoughts about this that seem a little
Well,
different.
I think Mike was really saying the same point, and he mentioned deforestation indirectly when he was talking about the Amazon. As luck would have it, I happened to watch John Oliver's show on HBO last night. I don't know if anybody else has seen John Oliver's recent show, but it was essentially about this topic. And he showed some graphics and had some data about the amount and rate of deforestation that are rather staggering to look at. And I believe a lot of these pandemics have started in areas of deforestation where humans have come in contact with animals that they wouldn't have come in contact with before, because the animals are forced to live closer to human settlement. I believe that's how Ebola started, was contact with a child had contact with a monkey that probably would not have occurred without deforestation. The other comment I would just make is that David, I thought you were really eloquent in your description. I wish you also had maybe you do, have some thoughts about the solution to that, how to make CS2 systems more adaptive. My worry in all of this is, are viruses to humans what comets were to dinosaurs? Sorry to be Debbie Downer there, but
Yeah. But that's a phrase that could be quoted a lot. David, were you going to respond?
Well, there's so much to say, but I think one thing to say is that because some kind of system level selection is the only thing that can work, it's the only thing that ever has worked. And so, in fact, we're surrounded by positive examples of at various scales of people who basically are trying to improve whole systems. They're systemic, they're experimental about it, they're pragmatic about it. In fact, the entire history of pragmatism is a philosophical tradition, which was inspired by Darwin in the 19th century, with people like William James and John Dewey and so on, basically taking an experimental approach to such things as national policy. It's really quite fascinating. And there's examples in management of corporations, for example, Toyota being a legendary example. If you look at their continuous improvement method, they're taking something like an automobile assembly plant as the whole system, and they're taking an experimental variation and selection approach to solving dysfunctions and the like. So I think it's not, I mean, it's even intuitive. People just kind of do it and they happen upon it because it's the only thing that does work. A systems engineer, for example, complex systems engineer knows that the only way you can't optimize a complex system by separately optimizing its parts. Back to the Challenger example. And so people have converged upon this again and again, typically though without having any kind of common language to do it. So I often talk about an archipelago of knowledge and practice where we're surrounded by good practices, but they're all discussed in ways that basically limits their influence. They're all come up against boundaries. And so a general level of description is in fact what's needed. And then we just need to become more mindful than ever before. And also, of course, the system is global. And then if we're not beginning with global recognizing that all of these things are global, and then everything underneath that has to be coordinated, then we're going to have treadmills for sure. So it really motivates a kind of a globalism. But of course, the way that globalism has to be panned out is completely different than globalism today. So, and so on and so forth. So there's too much to say about it. So, but anyhow, I mean, that's the kind of conversation we need to have. And I think that, when we think about what the discipline of sociology has to offer, I think that in some ways it has a great deal to offer, and in other ways, it's just an island in that archipelago I was talking about. And so somehow we could make use of the insights of sociology and yet escape that archipelago problem. And sociology, when you look at it, this is a conversation I've been having with Russ and Wengen, all along, is historically, I think, one of the last disciplines to actually become integrated and from an evolutionary perspective. And those might be fighting words, although maybe not among this particular group. But historically, in fact, it's tragic that the most field-oriented disciplines, sociology and cultural anthropology, are among the last to enter into dialogue with people who are approaching. I get some nodding heads here. People that are approaching, and finally, I mean, it's tragic because I don't want to go on, but if you go back to sociobiology days, Ed Wilson in 1975, at that point, evolutionists were guilty of genetic determinism. They had not studied culture, and so they were definitely guilty of being gene-centric. That was a legitimate critique at the time, and yet that is emphatically not true today. The evolutionists have taken on culture big time. And side by side with social constructionism, we have niche constructionism. If there's not common ground here to explore, I don't know how there is such common ground, and yet we still have this some sociological dynamic, which is why we're here today in a broad sense, in a sense of this whole series of how we can escape this archipelago problem for the discipline of sociology. So I've allowed myself to go on again a little bit too much, but anyhow, so I'm gonna take a vow of silence for the next 1 minute.
I thank you for posing the fundamental issue driving this discussion series, but I would actually ask Ed Gibney if he would take a vow of non-silence and perhaps spend a minute answering your own question, which you seemed to be in part doing about what the appropriate response should be to get off the treadmill.
Right. Okay, so I have to swear in for that non-vow. Thank you. Yeah, I know one of the things that David talks a lot about in his work is how regulation isn't necessarily a bad thing, that an unregulated organism is a dead organism. And so that's taking down the path of where I'm going. I was trying to ask Mike for his thoughts on how do we get off the treadmill. That you've done a great job analyzing this problem. But what about this? Do you have thoughts about the solutions? Speculative or published or whatever? So my wife is a green criminologist, and there are a couple green criminologists that publish a lot about treadmill of production theory, and they tend to just blame capitalism for it all and don't offer any solutions for it. Nor do they recognize that socialism and communist political economies also degrade the environment. So it isn't just capitalism; it's poorly regulated capitalism, in my view. And so, my wife and I have written a paper trying to suggest proper regulations using a redefinition of John Stuart Mill's harm principle that would allow us to implement better, as I say, better regulations. But going on and on. I have links to that paper in the comments, but I just want to hear your thoughts, since this is your event, on how to get off the treadmill.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question. I mean, if we're being perfectly honest, it's the most important question, right? If these dynamics are indeed as important as we are claiming they are, then how do we arrest them or prevent them from emerging in other forms? More importantly, and I think the two contexts in which I've most recently worked with these theories are, again, war on drugs in Latin America and the nuclear weapons. And so one point to be made here is we're recasting these theories in a way that views them as mechanisms which are contingent, culturally specific, and so prior research looking at these at the level of the world system has kind of assumed that wherever capitalism is in operation, a treadmill is in operation. And our contention is that, well, you may have found these statistical associations that's very informative and helpful, but theoretically speaking, it's not a useful theory if it just applies to everywhere capitalism exists all the time, right? And so we were trying to say there are specific instances in which capitalist modes of production, also perhaps as to another point I saw, other modes of production, or Soviet modes of production as well, take on organizational characteristics which rely upon these dynamics of extraction and increasingly larger inputs of waste into the environment. And so what are the things that allow these things to emerge? And what are the things, if they're missing, that these things can't emerge? And so when we were just recently in a 2020 article published in the Journal of World Systems Research, no less, we were kind of critiquing this and saying, well, if you look at the war on drugs and the environmental degradation related to coca production, well, as soon as the Colombian Civil War winds down just a couple of years ago, you have FARC, the revolutionary armed Marxist group there, they demobilize. And now you have this kind of like shift. You see, they call it the balloon effect, right? When drug production in Colombia doesn't just disappear, right? It just squeezes into another area of Latin America, and now it's in Peru, right? But so what's going on there now is a lot of these violent armed groups have now shifted to gold production. And so now instead of this coca treadmill, they've transferred the same schematic, the same cultural schema of extraction and production over to gold mining. And so you've got this, again, it's the idea that this is a contingent process. Everywhere that capitalism exists, there's not a treadmill, right? Only certain organizational emergences demonstrate this phenomenon. Similarly with the nuclear arms race, for those who are paying attention closely, we have now entered what has been called New Cold War 2.0, and there's a kind of a multilateral arms race building up. Well, the research that I did essentially showed that a fundamental component of this is secrecy, right? The national security state and military secrecy are what allow these dynamics not only to emerge and continue, but to accelerate, right? And so, for example, when we talk about nuclear war planning and the obviously all the bomb making and so forth that comes with that, these are decisions made by highly insular military bureaucracies with little to no oversight, and they're made decades in advance. There's no realistic public input into these decisions, right? And because again, they're made in secret. There's a long record of the U.S. military making these decisions, Strategic Air Command and NSC 68, dating all the way back to the 1950s. Again, the point here being these are specific dynamics that emerge in specific contingent historical and cultural contexts. And so understanding what components of the context give rise to these dynamics also gives us insight into how to keep them from emerging, right? So stopping a civil war in Colombia was a really good way to keep a coca production or a coca treadmill production from emerging. And that's one short answer to your question, a long way about.
So, Rosemary, you had some other thoughts about this, both in relation to the role of ideology and kind of comparative economic systems.
Uh, yes, I was thinking that the market is not always bad, and I pointed out that it's probably the thing historically that's lifted more people out of poverty, and we've witnessed it in our lifetimes in the last 20 or 30 years. You know, the marketization of China and India has lifted literally probably 1 billion people out of poverty. So I don't think we should be demonizing markets. And I was pointing out that when I talked about with animal welfare and meat production and forces against that have worked against factory farming, I think the philosopher Pete Singer has had a tremendous influence on encouraging people to either go vegetarian or make sure that their meat was not a product of these horrible animal factories they used to have. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that you can, the market, and the market has responded, hence all the humanely raised meat and so forth that you see in the grocery stores these days. So I guess what I'm just trying to say is that we shouldn't demonize the market, but we should realize that that the market can be shaped in ways that are healthier and more humane.
Thank you, Rosemary. Kurt Johnson, did you want to elaborate on your point about population genetics? And
yeah, I was just going to say, as I sit here, I just put in that note that, I've made this graduation from my 25 years at the American Museum of Natural History in New York in evolutionary biology to committees at the UN where we're talking about these same generalities. They would be unaware of, of these words, treadmills and macroparasites and so on. But when we're in those discussions, particularly of how all of these generalities are driving cultural effects and psychological effects at a global level, we end up jumping from the micro to the macro. So that's just, I'm sure that everyone's aware of that parallel. David's talked about it in his books, but I was just noting that as I was thinking through the comment on viruses and bolides versus, extinction of the dinosaurs or the fate of humanity, that, yeah, I mean, when I was getting my doctorate in evolutionary biology, it was the first time that catastrophe was entered into, how the math of population genetics was working. And then once a catastrophe is introduced into that math, then there really aren't any generalities. It's like breaking the balls on a pool table when you first hit the cue ball into all the rest of the ball. So there are just very interesting parallels here. And my last comment then is that obviously it's going to take a real interdisciplinary approach to how these generalities from the academic community, which are so powerful, end up being understood in this wider cultural context where severe challenges are really in our face.
And David?
I think it bears mentioning that if we look at the immediate response to the pandemic, not the broader issue of that we're talking about today of zoonotic transfer, we're not addressing that problem, but just how to contain the pandemic, how to roll out vaccines, how to get people to wear masks and so on and so forth. What we're seeing is, in the first place, tremendous variation among cultures, among nations. Some nations doing it much, much better than others. We all know that. But there's a lot of scholarly analysis of why that is, including Michelle Gelfin's work on tight and loose cultures, which I recommend to everyone. And then, although it could have happened much better, it's quite amazing that the whole globe is cooperating as much as it is, at least to solve that problem. And with a few more iterations, it would probably get to be still better. So I do think that we are capable of mounting these systemic efforts and have done so with, of course, variation, and that variation is, I mean, we're always looking around to see who's doing better than others. And then we're confronting deep cultural differences along the lines of this loose tight continuum, which some cultures are just a lot better able at collective action than others, in part based on a long history and in part based on a long history with diseases. So it's just very interesting to add that, I think, to the mix. And of course, none of that has been applied to the sort of second order question as to these crossovers and so on and so forth.
More on our reading list, but speaking of interdisciplinarity, Steve Gilbert, you were focusing on an example from social psychology, organizational psychology. What lesson was it about the Challenger disaster?
Well, I recently saw a documentary on the Challenger, and what struck me and what I posted was that, in a sense, I'm being a bit glib in phrasing it this way. It was really group psychology that did the Challenger in. There was hesitancy on NASA's part to give a go-ahead for the Challenger flight on the day that it exploded due to severely low temperatures and concerns about the O-rings, which we all know in hindsight, it was the O-rings that were the catastrophic failure. So NASA asked the subcontractor, I forget the name of that company, to have a meeting and advise NASA on whether to go or no go with the flight. So they gathered about 15 to 20 people in a room, all of the engineers and senior management. They began with an initial straw poll, and there was a unanimous vote among the engineers, no go. Tell NASA, no go. It's too dangerous. Some of the management folks, I don't mean to be vilifying management here, but this is how it went, said that we needed to discuss it. They needed to discuss it further. Long story short, at the end of an hour discussion with management, they changed their vote to go, advised NASA that it was okay to go, and we know what happened. So I'm a retired psychologist, so maybe I'm tuned into this aspect of things, but in that sense, it was what happened in that room with those 15 to 20 people and their group psychology, peer pressure from management, variety of things, that in a proximal way, at least, right? In a proximal way, maybe it wasn't the ultimate cause, but in a proximal way, that's what immediately led to the green light for the flight, and then the O-rings failed.
Seems that you could connect that back to Mike's caution about bureaucratic organization. But we are out of time at this point. Anyone like to make a last comment or add yet another book to our reading list on this topic?
I'd just like to thank everyone. If maybe I could end that way, to thank everyone, not least Russ and Rengen, for and the TVOL editorial staff for putting together this great series, and then putting together this great discussion around the series. I'd like to think of it as catalytic in terms of basically moving us along on this process of integration.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And I will say that I did finally hear from Erin Evans. There's no problem with her, but some confusions and communication. So we may hear from her in the future. It's been a wonderful session again, and thank you all for your participation and questions. I look forward to seeing everyone, as do Rengen and David, in 2 weeks from today.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.